Amid the simple routines of a bustling marketplace, a millionaire and a market vendor, long separated by pride and life choices, meet unexpectedly. Robert, a successful businessman but deeply lonely, is taken by surprise when a revelation is made by Emily, a 6-year-old girl with an innocent smile. What begins as a casual conversation in the park turns into a confrontation with the past, reopening emotional wounds and raising doubts about whether the distance between Robert and James, a humble market vendor, can be overcome. 6-year-old Emily ran happily through the park, her golden curls bouncing in the wind. It was a spring afternoon, and the air was light, filled with the fragrance of flowers lining the path. Her father, James, watched her from a distance, sitting on a simple bench near the park entrance. He always brought Emily here to play after his long day at the market, where he sold fruits and vegetables. Despite his tiring routine, James never missed a moment with his daughter. For him, Emily's joy was what lit up his simple life, one full of love. At the other end of the park, sitting on a more secluded bench, was Robert. He watched the park with distant eyes, almost as if unaware of the life bustling around him. A middle-aged man, dressed in impeccably tailored clothes that clashed with the casual atmosphere of the park. There was no rush in his movements, nor joy in his expression, just a quiet emptiness. To any passerby, Robert might seem like just another observer, but in reality, he carried a loneliness that no amount of wealth could fill. Emily, ever curious, noticed the man sitting alone. With the innocent curiosity typical of her age, she skipped over, hopping on the stones that paved the way to Robert's bench. He didn't notice the little figure approaching until she was just a few feet away, her small steps lightly tapping the ground as she walked. "Hi." Emily's voice was soft but full of energy. Robert looked up, surprised to see the little girl standing in front of him, a bright smile on her face. "Hi," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if he wasn't used to speaking. "Are you lost?" Emily giggled, shaking her head. "No, I just saw you sitting here all alone. Why are you alone?" Her question caught Robert off guard. No one had ever confronted him so directly, especially not a child. He hesitated, thinking of a simple answer, something to gently send her away. But before he could say anything, Emily continued. "I think I've seen you before," she said, eyeing him with a sharp gaze. Robert frowned. "Seen me before? Where?" The girl thought for a moment, lightly biting her lower lip. "In my dad's wallet. There's a picture of you in there." That hit Robert like a jolt. He blinked, confused, trying to process what he just heard. "In your dad's wallet? That's not possible." Emily nodded eagerly. "Yes, it is. There's a picture of you in his wallet. You and him are in the picture together. My dad showed it to me once." The girl's words echoed in Robert's mind. He could hardly believe it. Could it be true? He and James hadn't seen each other in nearly a decade after a bitter falling out that had driven them apart. James, the brother he had left behind, had chosen a simple life while Robert pursued ambition and wealth. For years, Robert had avoided thinking about the past, but now, this little girl was forcing him to remember everything. "Who's your dad?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his heart raced. "James," Emily answered cheerfully, unaware of the weight of her words. "My dad's name is James. He works at a market selling fruits. He brings me here to play every day after work." That simple answer hit Robert like a punch. James, his brother. He suddenly felt breathless, guilt and regret, long buried, beginning to rise. How could he have let so much time pass without trying to reconnect with the only brother he had? Does he talk about me?" Robert asked hesitantly, almost afraid of the answer. Emily shrugged, distracted. "He showed me your picture once and said you're his brother, but he doesn't talk much about it. He just said you were friends when you were little." Robert felt a lump forming in his throat. Friends. The word felt so distant now. How had they drifted so far apart? Emily, oblivious to the depth of emotion her words had stirred, smiled again before running back to her father, leaving Robert alone, lost in thought. He watched her go, his heart heavy, the little girl's words echoing in his mind like an unwelcome reminder of the past he had avoided for so long. When Emily finally reached James, she took his hand, tugging him to play a bit more. James glanced toward where she had been, seeing only the figure of a man sitting in the distance. He didn't think much of it, but deep down, he felt a slight unease, as if something was shifting in the air. Robert sat there for a long time, watching the little girl and her father walk away. His heart was restless. Memories began to flood back, bringing with them the weight of years of silence and distance. What had kept him from reaching out to James? Pride? Fear? Shame? He knew that after this encounter, he could no longer ignore what he had left behind. Robert returned to his mansion in the city's most luxurious neighborhood, but the drive didn't feel the same as usual. For the first time in years, his mind was filled with memories, questions, and emotions he thought he had buried forever. The encounter with Emily in the park and the unexpected mention of James had unsettled him, shaking the emotional stability he had maintained through strict isolation. When he arrived home, Robert stepped out of his car and looked around, as if seeing the place with new eyes. The mansion was immense, flawless, with perfectly manicured gardens and a facade that radiated luxury. But, contrary to what it represented to the world, to Robert, it was just a monument to the loneliness he had built over the years. He walked through the main door, greeted by the usual silence. No voices, no laughter, just the echo of his own footsteps through the vast corridors. He dropped his keys on a marble table in the entrance hall and headed to the living room. It was a grand room, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the city. Yet Robert rarely spent time there. In fact, he hardly cared about that view anymore. The emptiness he felt was suffocating him more and more, and that afternoon in the park had only magnified that feeling. He collapsed into a leather armchair near the fireplace, which was unlit. As he settled in, his thoughts drifted back to the past, revisiting memories he had avoided for so long. James. His brother's name echoed in his mind, as if every mention of him by little Emily had been a key to unlock a compartment inside himself. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to sink into the memories. Years ago, when he and James were still young, they had been inseparable. They grew up in a humble home, but it was full of affection, where money was never abundant, but family love made up for the hardships. They shared everything: clothes, toys, dreams. Robert had always been ambitious, dreaming big, while James was more grounded, content with the simple things in life. But as the years passed, their worldviews began to diverge. Robert threw himself into the professional world, determined to make a fortune, while James chose the quiet life of a market vendor, staying true to the simplicity they grew up with. The separation between them happened slowly but was cemented by a fight that changed their lives forever. Pride, misunderstandings, and different choices drove them apart, and none of the rare attempts at reconciliation could overcome the years of resentment that had accumulated. How did we let this happen? Robert murmured to himself, his voice breaking the silence of the room. For so long, he had justified the distance by telling himself he was too busy, that James had chosen that path. He thought that material success and climbing the corporate ladder were proof enough that he was right. But now, the image of James as a simple market vendor, raising his daughter alone, troubled him more than he cared to admit. The vision of that little girl, Emily, with her innocent smile, stirred something in him that he couldn't explain. Robert pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen, unsure. His impulse was to call James, but at the same time, pride and fear of rejection held him back. What would he even say? How do you apologize for years of silence? He knew it wouldn't be easy. The distance between them felt as wide as the differences that had separated them. He gave up on the idea, at least for now. He wasn't ready to deal with all of it just yet. Instead, Robert walked over to a cabinet in the corner of the room and grabbed an old bottle of whiskey. He poured some into a glass, staring at the amber liquid before taking a sip. The alcohol burned his throat slightly, but it wasn't enough to chase away the feeling of emptiness that had been following him. The weight of solitude, which he had once borne with cold acceptance, now felt unbearable. His mind drifted back to Emily, and he wondered what kind of life James was providing for his daughter. Not that he doubted his brother's abilities as a father, but he knew the financial struggles James likely faced. Maybe he could help in some way. It wouldn't be difficult for him to transfer a significant amount of money to James, easing his worries. But he knew the issue went far beyond money. Money, that had been the cause of their separation in the first place. For years, Robert had believed that financial success was the ultimate goal, the thing that would give meaning to his life. He had achieved more than he ever dreamed, but now, he felt the void growing with every new luxury he acquired. His wealth hadn't brought him the peace he thought it would, only isolated him further. "What am I doing?" he whispered to himself, feeling a tightness in his chest. Sitting there, still holding the glass, Robert finally allowed himself to admit something he had buried for a long time. He missed James. He missed the simplicity, the honesty, the uncomplicated company that his brother had represented. All the parties, business meetings, and luxuries he had accumulated didn't replace the human connection he had lost. Robert looked at his phone again. Maybe it was time to act, to try to fix what had been broken so long ago. But how would he do that? Where would he start? He knew that to attempt a reconciliation, he would have to face his own failures, admit his mistakes, and let go of the pride that had kept him distant for so many years. He set the glass down on the table and stood up. Walking over to the window, he looked out over the city below. The lights sparkled in the night, and everything seemed so distant, so irrelevant. He felt small, as if all his success meant nothing in the face of the reality confronting him now. The encounter with Emily in the park hadn't been a coincidence. He was sure of that. It was a sign that something needed to change. He knew he couldn't continue ignoring the past and hiding behind his wealth. It was time to face what really mattered. The next morning, James woke up early, as he did every day. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when he was already up, ready for another day at the market. It was a daily ritual, simple, but one he deeply appreciated. After his wife's death, caring for his daughter and working to support her had become the center of his life. Emily, with her bright smile and boundless energy, was his daily motivation. While making breakfast, Emily ran into the kitchen, wearing a floral dress James had bought at the market a few weeks ago. "Dad, I saw that man yesterday," she said with the casualness typical of a child, unaware of the impact her words could have. James frowned, not understanding right away. "What man, sweetheart?" he asked, as he finished buttering a piece of toast. "The man in the park," she replied, sitting down at the table. "I talked to him. He was sitting alone, and he looked sad. But I had seen his picture before, in your wallet." James froze for a moment. "In my wallet?" He immediately knew who she was referring to. Only one person could be in that picture. "Yes," Emily said, innocently. "The man in the picture with you when you were younger." James sighed, setting the toast aside. It had been years since he'd seen Robert. So many years that he'd grown used to not thinking about his brother. Of course, the picture was still there, tucked away in his wallet, a remnant of a life long past. But James rarely looked at it. He never spoke about Robert to Emily. There wasn't any explicit bitterness, just a quiet sadness about what could have been. When he and Robert parted ways, James believed that one day, everything might resolve itself, but over time, that one day never came. "Dad?" Emily's soft voice pulled him back to the present. "Yes, sweetheart?" James replied, turning his attention to his daughter. "Why don't you talk to him?" The simple question cut deep. Emily, in her innocence, couldn't understand the complexities of the feelings that surrounded the brothers' separation. To her, everything was clear and straightforward. If there was a picture, if there was a story, why not just fix everything? James sat down at the table across from his daughter. He tried to smile, but the gesture felt forced. "Well, sometimes people go down different paths, you know? It doesn't mean we don't care, but things can change." Emily looked at her father with her big, inquisitive eyes. "Do you still like him?" The question left him momentarily speechless. Like him? He had never stopped loving his brother. But over the years, pride and circumstances had distanced them so much that reconciliation felt like a remote, almost impossible idea. "Of course I do, Emily," he finally answered. "I'll always love your uncle. He's my brother." Emily gave a small smile, satisfied with the simple answer, unaware of the layers of pain behind it. She quickly moved on to talking about other things, about the game she wanted to play later, as if the previous subject had never been so heavy. James watched his daughter eat, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about Robert. Where was he now? Maybe he was still living in that big house in the city, surrounded by wealth and power, living the life he had always wanted. The life they once dreamed about together, but which James had chosen to walk away from. For him, a simple life was enough, but he never questioned his brother's ambition, at least, not until it tore them apart. The sound of the kettle brought him back to the kitchen, and he got up to finish making breakfast. Despite trying to focus on his routine, the thought of Emily's meeting with Robert in the park lingered in his mind. Later that same day, James was at the market, organizing the fruit at his stand as the first customers of the day began to arrive. The market was the heartbeat of the neighborhood, where people didn't just come to shop, but to talk, exchange news, and, in some ways, reconnect with the community. James had always loved the environment. He knew most people by name, knew their stories, and felt part of something bigger than himself. He enjoyed the hands-on work. There was an honest simplicity in selling fruits and vegetables that he had grown himself. The daily routine, though exhausting, gave him purpose. And, above all, it allowed him to care for Emily the way he believed was best. Despite the financial struggles, they had never gone hungry, and for James, that was enough. As he wiped down some apples, his mind wandered back to the past. He remembered how he and Robert used to play pretend when they were kids. In the backyard of their old house, Robert always pretended to be a businessman, while James played the farmer. Back then, it all seemed like a game, but somehow, the roles they had chosen became their adult realities. "Good morning, James." The voice of a regular customer pulled him from his thoughts. He smiled, greeting the elderly woman with a nod, and started helping her pick out some apples, trying to push away the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. As the day went on, James slipped back into his usual routine, but the thought of Robert and the photo in his wallet stayed firmly in his mind. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe it was time to reconsider. He wondered if Robert thought about him in the same way. Did his brother miss the bond they once had? Or was he completely immersed in the world of wealth he had built for himself? No matter how hard he tried to carry on with his life, that Saturday morning felt different. Emily, with her innocent wisdom, had awakened something in James that he thought had long been buried. The possibility of reconciliation. He knew that pride still held him back, but the idea of finally seeing his brother again was beginning to settle in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, it was possible to break down the barriers time and pride had built. At the end of the day, when he closed up his stall, James pulled out his wallet to count the day's earnings. The picture of Robert, still young, smiled back at him from within the plastic pocket. James stared at it for a long moment, not saying a word. Part of him wanted to forget everything, to continue on as he always had. But another part, perhaps the part hidden deep in his heart, wanted something different. He put the wallet back in his pocket, still undecided on what to do. But now, the idea of reaching out to Robert didn't seem as impossible as it once had. Robert spent the next few days caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. The encounter with Emily in the park weighed on him more than he liked to admit. He found himself constantly thinking about James, about what had happened between them and the choices that had led them down such different paths. Back in his routine as a businessman, Robert tried to stay focused, but his thoughts always drifted back to his brother and the little girl who, with a few innocent words, had shattered the wall of pride he had built over the years. On Wednesday morning, Robert sat in his private office, located on the top floor of his enormous house. The space was large, with huge windows offering a stunning view of the city, but at that moment, he barely noticed the luxury around him. Sitting in his leather chair, he leaned back, staring at the phone on his desk. Several times over the past few days, he had thought about reaching out to James, but something always held him back. It was hard to face the past, harder still to admit that he had been wrong to let years of silence and resentment build up. Robert picked up the phone, hesitating. Instead of dialing James' number, he made a different choice. He decided to contact someone who could find out how James was doing. Someone who could give him a clear view of his brother's life without Robert having to get personally involved, at least not yet. He hired a private investigator, something he often did for his business dealings, but this time for personal reasons that unsettled him deeply. "I need you to find out everything about James Miller," Robert said to the investigator over the phone. "He lives in a simple area, probably still working as a vendor. Find out where he lives, his living conditions, and anything that might be relevant." On the other end of the line, the investigator, used to such requests, accepted the job without question. Robert hung up, feeling slightly relieved, but still uneasy. He knew that requesting this information was a way of postponing the real confrontation with James, but he couldn't help it. He needed time, needed to prepare himself emotionally to deal with the past. As he waited for the investigator's report, Robert couldn't stop the flood of memories that began to resurface. The two brothers, inseparable in childhood, shared everything. He remembered the long afternoons playing in the backyard, how James had always been quieter, but fiercely loyal. He remembered how their parents always taught them that family came first. The problem was that, as they grew older, their priorities changed, at least for Robert. In their youth, Robert had always been ambitious. He dreamed big, wanted more than the simple life their parents led. He wanted money, success, respect. James, on the other hand, was more content. For him, life didn't need to be grand. He was happy following in their parents' footsteps, working with his hands, living with what he considered essential. The fight that had torn them apart was the culmination of years of unresolved differences. When their father passed away, Robert wanted to sell the family's small property and invest the money in new ventures. James refused, arguing that the land had sentimental value and should be kept. The arguments became bitter, and at some point, both said things they would regret forever. Robert left the family home that day, and the two never spoke again. As he waited for the investigator's findings, Robert reflected on how insignificant that argument seemed now. Life had moved on, but for all the financial success he had achieved, the void left by not having James in his life was something he could no longer ignore. 2 days later, the investigator's report arrived. Robert took it in his hands, his expression tense as he opened it. He sat at his desk, took a deep breath, and began reading. The information was objective and straightforward. James still lived in a simple neighborhood, and his daily routine was described in detail. He worked as a market vendor, just as Robert had imagined, and lived a modest life with his daughter, Emily. As he read, a feeling of discomfort settled over Robert. James was living a life that many would consider difficult, but the report showed that he was well respected in the community and was a devoted father. Emily, according to the information, seemed to be the center of James' world. That made Robert feel even more guilty. While he isolated himself in his bubble of wealth and success, his brother was struggling to raise a daughter on his own. There was something in the report, however, that caught Robert's attention the most. Despite all the difficulties, James never complained about his life. He seemed to have accepted his path with serenity, and that deeply affected Robert. He, who had always chased after more money, more success, more recognition, now realized that James had somehow found peace in his simple life. When he finished reading the report, Robert felt a mixture of relief and sadness. On the one hand, knowing that James was okay gave him some peace of mind. But on the other hand, it only made it more evident how much he had lost by staying away. There was a decade of silence between them, a decade of missed opportunities to reconnect. "You always thought you were right," James said, his voice laced with frustration. "You always thought you knew what was best, not just for you, but for everyone. When our father died, you didn't even want to talk about it. Everything was about money, about what to do with the land, about how to invest. And I couldn't compete with that. I just wanted to keep what was ours." Robert felt the weight of James' words, remembering vividly the bitter arguments they had after their father's death. At the time, he had been so focused on his career, on growing and conquering the world, that he refused to listen to his brother's perspective. To him, the family land was just a financial asset that could be used to boost his business. But to James, that piece of land represented their roots, the place where they had grown up, where their family had formed. "I was wrong," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was so blinded by what I thought was success that I didn't see what I was losing. And now, it feels like it's too late to fix everything." James looked at him for a long moment, the words sinking in. He knew his brother was being sincere, but he also knew that some wounds were hard to heal. "Maybe it is too late to fix everything," James said quietly, "but it's not too late to try again." The silence that followed was heavy, but this time it didn't carry the same tension as before. Robert looked at James, taking in what he had just said. It wasn't the complete forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was a start. Maybe the only start he could expect. Emily, who had been quietly observing the two men with her large, curious eyes, finally spoke, cutting through the silence with her soft voice. "Are you guys fighting?" she asked, her innocent question breaking the tension. James smiled at his daughter, trying to ease her concern. "No, sweetheart," he said. "We're just talking." Robert looked at Emily and smiled. "Yeah, just talking," he echoed, realizing that, in a way, the simplicity of her view on things carried a truth that he and James had forgotten over the years. Maybe, in the end, what they needed was just that, to talk, to understand each other's point of view, and maybe find a way back. As lunch progressed, the atmosphere grew lighter. There were still many unresolved feelings between the two brothers, but the simple fact that they were sitting at the same table, sharing a meal, was a significant first step. And that was something. By the end of the meal, Robert felt that something had shifted. The past still lingered between them, but there was now an openness, a possibility for reconciliation that he had never imagined possible. And as scary as it was, he was ready to keep trying. Lunch was being prepared in James' small house, just a few blocks from the market. The kitchen was simple but cozy, with walls adorned with photos of Emily at different stages of her childhood, and small keepsakes from their family life. Robert sat at the little table in the living room, feeling somewhat out of place, as if he were observing someone else's life from a distance. The simplicity of the house contrasted sharply with the opulence he was used to, yet something about the environment made him feel uncomfortably at ease, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. James was in the kitchen, chatting casually with Emily as he prepared lunch. He did his best to keep the atmosphere light, but his mind was racing with thoughts about Robert's unexpected visit. He cast occasional glances at his brother, trying to process his presence after so many years. The last time they were together, tension had filled the air, with words said that left deep wounds on both sides. Emily, oblivious to the heavy emotions between the two men, was as lively as ever. "Dad, can I set the table?" she asked, running to grab the plates. "Sure, sweetheart," James replied, smiling as he watched his daughter. She picked up the plates with the enthusiasm typical of children and started placing them on the table, all under Robert's watchful eye. As Robert observed the scene, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. On one hand, he was grateful to be there, invited to share a meal with his brother and niece. On the other hand, he knew there was an invisible wall between him and James, something that would need to be addressed before they could truly reconnect. After a few minutes, lunch was ready. James placed the dishes on the table, and the three sat down to eat. The silence, which had been manageable before, now grew heavier. Robert, feeling the need to say something, decided to break it. "You have a nice home, James," he said, his voice a bit hesitant but sincere. James looked at him for a moment before responding. "It's simple, but it's what I need. Emily and I do our best here." Robert nodded, taking a sip of water. He knew that the next question would dig up old wounds, but he couldn't put it off any longer. He needed to understand what had really happened between them and why they had allowed so much time to pass without fixing it. "James," Robert began cautiously, I know I don't have the right to just show up like this after so long, but I want to understand. Why did we never try to fix things? Was what happened between us really that big?" James stopped cutting his food and looked directly at his brother. His face was serious, but there was something deeper, a contained pain that he seemed to have carried for years. "Robert, you're the one who walked away," he said, his voice calm but tinged with bitterness. "When the fight happened, I tried to reach out, tried to talk, but you were already set on your path. It felt like your success mattered more to you than anything else. The business, the money, it all came between us. And eventually, I gave up." James' words hit Robert hard. He knew he had distanced himself, but hearing it from James, with such clarity and emotion, made the reality of their separation even more painful. It was difficult to admit that, in his pursuit of what he thought was success, he had left behind the only person who had truly cared for him. "I never wanted it to be that way," Robert said quietly, his voice low. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I worked hard, got everything I thought I wanted, but somehow, I lost the things that really mattered." James looked at him in silence, seeing the vulnerability in his brother's face. For the first time in years, Robert seemed reachable, open. The man who had once appeared untouchable, wrapped up in his ambitions, was now sitting in front of him, admitting his mistakes. James could feel the old resentment rising within him, but at the same time, there was a part of him that had longed for this moment of reconciliation. "You always thought you knew what was best," James said, his frustration creeping into his voice. "When Dad died, you didn't even want to talk about it. It was all about money, what to do with the land, how to invest. And I couldn't compete with that. All I wanted was to hold on to what was ours." Robert felt the weight of James' words, remembering all too clearly the bitter arguments that had followed their father's death. Back then, Robert had been so consumed by his career, his drive to succeed, that he refused to see things from his brother's perspective. For him, the family land was just an asset, something to sell and reinvest. But to James, that land was their roots, a symbol of their family's history and the life they had once shared. "I was wrong," Robert admitted, his voice faltering slightly. "I was so blinded by my ambitions that I didn't realize what I was giving up. And now, it feels like it's too late to make things right." James studied his brother for a long moment, processing what he had just said. He knew Robert was being sincere, but he also knew that some wounds weren't easy to heal. "Maybe it is too late to fix everything," James said softly, "but it's not too late to try to start again." The silence that followed was heavy, but this time, it carried a different kind of weight. Robert looked at James, taking in what he had just said. It wasn't the complete forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was a beginning. Perhaps the only beginning he could realistically expect. Emily, who had been quietly eating her lunch, suddenly spoke up, her voice breaking the tension. "Are you guys fighting?" she asked, her innocent question cutting through the emotional heaviness. James smiled at his daughter, trying to reassure her. "No, sweetie," he said gently. "We're just talking." Robert looked at Emily and smiled, feeling a strange sense of clarity. "Yeah, just talking," he echoed, realizing that, in many ways, that was exactly what they needed to do. Talk, listen, and maybe find a way back to each other. As lunch went on, the mood lightened. There were still unresolved emotions between the brothers, but the simple act of sharing a meal together, sitting at the same table, was a significant first step. Later, after Emily had gone to bed, James and Robert sat in the living room, the day's conversation still lingering between them. The silence was more comfortable now, but there was still a sense that more needed to be said. Finally, James spoke. "Do you regret it, Robert? All the success, the money. Do you ever regret choosing that over everything else?" Robert leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the quiet street beyond. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there are moments when I wonder what my life would have been like if I had chosen a different path. But I thought I was doing what I needed to do. I thought success would bring me happiness." "And did it?" James asked, his voice calm but probing. Robert shook his head. "No, not in the way I thought it would. I have everything I ever wanted, but none of it means anything without the people who mattered most." James nodded, understanding. "You and I always wanted different things. You wanted more, and I just wanted enough. I never judged you for that, but it hurt when you walked away." "I know," Robert said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I was right that you'd understand, but I was wrong." James sighed, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also relief that they were finally having this conversation. "I missed you, Robert," he said, his voice softer now, "but I didn't know how to reach you. After a while, I stopped trying." Robert looked at his brother, his heart heavy with guilt. "I missed you too, James. I just didn't realize it until it was too late." The two brothers sat in silence for a long time, both processing the weight of their words. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. They had both carried their own pain for so long, and now, little by little, they were beginning to let it go. "I don't know if we can ever get back to the way things were," James said quietly, "but I'd like to try." Robert nodded, feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. "I'd like that too." For the first time in a long while, they shared a moment of understanding. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a step toward healing. They both knew it would take time, but they were finally ready to try. The afternoon following their emotional conversation, Robert found himself driving back to James' house. This time, however, the weight of their past seemed lighter. While they hadn't fully resolved everything, the fact that they were finally talking and acknowledging their shared history was a significant breakthrough. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, Robert couldn't help but feel that life had a strange way of bringing the past back into focus when least expected. When Robert arrived, Emily greeted him at the door, her usual excitement lighting up her face. "Uncle Robert!" she cried, running up to him and hugging his legs. Robert smiled and picked her up. The word uncle still felt new to him, but it warmed him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had spent years disconnected from his family, and now, hearing Emily call him uncle, made him feel like he was finally reconnecting with a part of himself he had long forgotten. "Emily, what have you been up to?" he asked playfully. "I've been drawing with Dad," she said excitedly. "Come see." She tugged him along to the backyard, where James was sitting at a wooden table, surrounded by sheets of paper and colored pencils. The scene felt almost nostalgic, a reminder of simpler times. The small backyard, with trees in the distance and the sound of birds nearby, took Robert back to his own childhood. For a fleeting moment, he felt like he was back there, before everything between him and James had grown complicated. James looked up when he saw Robert approach, and this time, his smile seemed more genuine, less strained. "Welcome back," he said, pulling out a chair for his brother. "We're just drawing a little." Robert sat down, glancing at Emily's drawing, a picture of a house with trees around it, a smiling sun, and 3 figures holding hands. "Is that me?" he asked, pointing to one of the figures. "Yep." Emily beamed. "You're part of our family now." The simplicity of her words struck Robert deeply. For so long, he had felt like an outsider, as if he didn't belong anywhere. But now, sitting here with James and Emily, he was starting to feel something different, a sense of belonging. After Emily went back inside to grab more paper, the two brothers were left alone in the quiet backyard. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. There was a peace in the simplicity of the moment. "Do you remember when we used to draw in the backyard of our old house?" Robert asked with a nostalgic smile. "You always drew the best trees. I could barely manage a circle." James chuckled, shaking his head. "I remember. But you were better at drawing houses. You always drew those big mansions. Guess you ended up getting one." Robert smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in his expression. "Yeah, but it wasn't exactly what I imagined when we were kids." James looked at him quietly, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. Robert had achieved the material success he had always dreamed of, but he had lost sight of what really mattered along the way. Now, it seemed that his brother was starting to realize that. "You remember the adventures we used to make up?" James asked, lightening the mood. "We pretended the backyard was a jungle, and you were always the explorer." Robert laughed. "And you were the local guide, leading us out of danger. I wouldn't have made it out without you." The memory brought a sense of levity to the moment. It was as if, for a brief time, they could go back to being those kids who explored the world together before life's complications pulled them apart. "I miss that," Robert said quietly. "I miss how simple things used to be, before everything changed." James sighed, looking out at the trees lining the yard. "I miss it too. Sometimes I wonder what we could have done differently, but we can't change the past, Robert. All we can do is try to move forward." Robert nodded, knowing James was right. They had lost a lot of years, and nothing they said or did could change that. But perhaps there was still time to build something new. "You're right," he said softly. "I just hope we can find a way to get back what we lost." James looked at Robert, seeing how much his brother had changed. The man in front of him wasn't the same ambitious, reckless young man who had distanced himself from his family all those years ago. This Robert seemed humbled, more aware of the consequences of his choices. And in that, James found a little hope. "I think we can," James said, honestly. Before they could say more, Emily came running back, holding more paper and crayons. "Are you going to draw with me?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. James and Robert exchanged smiles. "Of course," Robert said, picking up a crayon. "Let's all draw together." As they sat in the backyard, drawing and laughing, Robert felt a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in years. It was a feeling that, despite all the time that had passed and the mistakes that had been made, there was still room to build new memories. That evening, surrounded by the sounds of nature and the innocent laughter of Emily, Robert realized that what mattered most wasn't the success he had achieved or the wealth he had accumulated. It was the connections he had lost, the relationships he was now beginning to rebuild. It wasn't just about reconnecting with his brother. It was about finding his way back to the things that truly mattered. For the first time in a long time, Robert felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next day, Robert returned to James' house, already feeling more at home. The once heavy atmosphere between the brothers was now lighter, their interactions more natural. Although the pain from the past hadn't disappeared, the walls between them were beginning to come down, one brick at a time. When Robert stepped inside, the sound of laughter from the kitchen immediately greeted him. Emily was in the middle of the kitchen, excitedly mixing cookie dough while James helped steady the bowl. It was a domestic scene, warm and filled with the kind of joy Robert hadn't experienced in his life of luxury. He paused at the doorway, watching them with a soft smile. "Can I help? Or do you two already have everything under control?" he asked with a grin as he entered the kitchen. Emily turned to him, her face lighting up. "Uncle Robert, want to make cookies with us?" "Of course, I'd love to," Robert replied, grabbing an apron and joining the controlled chaos of the kitchen. As they baked cookies, Robert felt more and more like part of the family. He watched the way James and Emily worked together, the ease and love they shared in every small interaction. It was something Robert had never had for himself, the kind of simple but profound connection that came from being fully present in each other's lives. When the cookies were finally in the oven, the three of them sat in the living room to wait. Emily, exhausted from all the excitement, eventually dozed off on the couch beside Robert, her head resting against his arm. James looked at his daughter, a soft smile on his face. "She's my whole world," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "After Sarah died, I don't know what I would have done without her." Robert knew very little about James' late wife, Sarah. He had heard that she passed away years ago, but back then, he had been so absorbed in his own life that he hadn't been there for James. Now, looking at his brother, Robert realized the depth of loss James had endured, raising a child without his partner by his side. "I'm sorry, James," Robert said sincerely. "I wasn't there when you needed me." James shook his head, his eyes still on Emily. "Life doesn't stop, Robert. I had to keep going, for her. Emily gave me purpose when I thought I didn't have the strength to go on." A heavy silence settled between them. Robert had never experienced a loss like James had, and he couldn't imagine the pain of raising a child alone. But what he saw now was the strength of his brother, the way James had found a reason to keep going, despite the hardships. "I admire you," Robert said after a moment, his voice soft. "You've always been strong. You've always found a way to move forward, even when things were hard." James glanced at him, surprised but also touched by Robert's words. It's not about being strong. It's about not having a choice. When someone depends on you, like Emily depends on me, you find a way. Robert nodded, thinking about what James had said. He had always believed that success came from making the right decisions in business. But now he was starting to understand that true success was about the impact you had on the lives of the people you loved. You're a good father, James, Robert said, looking down at Emily, who was still asleep. Emily's lucky to have you. James smiled, but there was a weariness in that smile, as if the responsibilities of being a single parent weighed on him more than he let on. I do what I can, he replied humbly. It's not always easy. There are days when I wonder if I'm doing everything right, if I'm giving her what she needs. Robert shook his head. You are, James. It's clear in how happy she is, how strong your bond is. James stayed quiet for a moment, reflecting on his brother's words. There were so many things he had never shared with anyone, not because he didn't want to, but because he had never had someone he trusted enough to share the burden. But now, sitting with Robert, he felt a sense of openness, a desire to share more about the struggles he had faced. When Sarah died, I didn't think I'd be able to raise Emily on my own, James said, his voice a little shaky now. I was lost. Losing someone like that. It's like losing a part of yourself, and suddenly, you have a child depending on you for everything, and you don't know if you can do it. Robert felt a knot form in his chest as he listened to the pain in James' voice. He had never imagined his brother had carried this weight alone. I didn't know it was so hard for you, Robert said, remorse heavy in his voice. I should have been there for you. I don't know why I wasn't. James shook his head. What's done is done, Robert. There's no point in looking back with guilt. But I won't lie, there were times when I wondered where you were, why you didn't show up. Hearing that from James hit Robert with a force he hadn't expected. He had always known that his absence had left a mark, but hearing it directly from his brother made the reality even more painful. I wish I could go back and change it, Robert said, his voice thick with regret. I was so caught up in my own ambitions that I left you behind. James took a deep breath, clearly fighting against emotions he had kept buried for a long time. It was hard, yeah, he admitted, his voice controlled, but in the end, I did what I had to do. And somehow, we made it through. Robert felt the weight of his guilt, but also a sense of relief that they were finally having this conversation. It was something he had put off for years, but now, it was in front of them, demanding to be addressed. I want to be here for you now, James. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your life, part of Emily's life. James looked at him, his eyes softening. Maybe that's what we need, Robert. Maybe it's time to stop looking back and start building something new. Robert nodded, feeling the truth of James' words. He knew the road to full reconciliation would be long, but for now, they had taken a huge step forward. There were still wounds to heal, but they were finally trying. As they sat there, watching Emily sleep peacefully on the couch, the warmth of the moment seemed to envelop the two brothers. It was a small moment of peace, but for Robert, it meant so much more. It was the start of something he never thought he would have again. Family. A few days later, Robert found himself back at the market where James worked. His visits had become more frequent, and the initial awkwardness that marked his first appearance had faded. Over the past few days, he and James had spent more time together, having long conversations that, while painful, were helping them heal. Emily, ever full of life, treated Robert as if he had always been there, making each interaction feel natural and unforced. When Robert approached the fruit stall, he was greeted by Emily, who ran up to him with her usual enthusiasm. "Uncle Robert, you're here," she exclaimed, hugging him tightly. "Want to help me sell fruit today?" Robert laughed, charmed by his niece's boundless energy. "Of course, I'm going to be the best apple seller this market has ever seen," he joked, glancing toward James, who waved at him with a relaxed smile. James, unlike during Robert's first visit, seemed more comfortable now. It was clear that, with time, the two brothers were growing accustomed to each other's presence, rebuilding the connection that had been lost. Their relationship was still fragile, but with each conversation and each shared moment, they were laying the foundation for something new. The three of them spent the morning at the stall, talking with customers, selling fruit, and sharing lighthearted moments. For Robert, the experience was entirely new, a far cry from the life of luxury and isolation he had led for so long. Yet, somehow, this simple life felt far more meaningful than any business deal or million-dollar transaction he had ever made. During a brief break, while Emily ran off to play, James and Robert sat together, sipping coffee from a makeshift stall. The morning sun shone softly, and the lively market hummed with the sounds of people talking, laughing, and going about their day. It was a scene Robert had never fully appreciated before, but now it held a new kind of significance. "You seem more at ease here," James commented, observing his brother. "Almost like you're getting used to this simple life." Robert smiled, looking down at his coffee. "I guess I've spent so long chasing more money, more success, more recognition, that I never realized what I was missing. Being here with you and Emily, it's made me see things differently. All that stuff I thought mattered, it doesn't mean anything without people who actually care." James stayed quiet for a moment, letting Robert's words sink in. Life's not as complicated as we make it out to be sometimes. It's the simple things that are the most important: family, honesty, friendship. I figured that out a long time ago, but you were always the ambitious one. I guess it took you a little longer to understand. Robert nodded, knowing James was right. For so long, he had measured success by the zeros in his bank account and the prestige of his career. But now, he saw that true success was measured by the connections you built and the people you shared your life with. The two of them sat in silence for a while, watching the market move around them. The tension that had once hung between them had eased, and though there was still work to do, they were finally on the same page. Just as the moment began to feel truly peaceful, Emily returned, breathless from running around. "Uncle Robert, Dad," she called, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I was thinking." Robert turned to her, smiling. "What were you thinking, Emily?" She took a deep breath, ready to reveal her big idea. "I was thinking that you and Dad should be friends again." "You were friends, right?" "He told me." Robert and James exchanged glances, both taken aback by the simplicity of Emily's statement. James sighed, smiling softly at his daughter. "Yes, Emily, we were friends. Before everything happened, we were best friends." Emily turned her bright eyes toward Robert, waiting for his response. Robert felt a tightening in his chest. In her innocent way, Emily had captured something essential. If they had once been friends, why couldn't they be again? "She's right," Robert said, looking at James. "We were friends, and I think we can be again." James looked at his brother, weighing his words carefully. He knew that healing their relationship wouldn't be easy, but maybe Emily had seen something that they had been too blinded by pride and hurt to notice. Deep down, their friendship had been the foundation of their relationship, and perhaps that was what they needed to rebuild. Emily, satisfied with their answers, beamed. "I knew you could be friends again. Now we're a family, right?" Her words hung in the air, simple but profound. Robert and James couldn't help but laugh, the tension between them dissolving in that moment. It wasn't a magical fix to all their problems, but it was a start, and that was enough. Later that afternoon, as the market began to wind down, James and Robert decided to take Emily to the nearby park for a picnic. Sitting on the grass under the shade of a large tree, they reminisced about their childhood, laughing about old adventures and the games they used to play. Emily's laughter echoed around them, filling the air with a lightness that neither brother had felt in years. As they watched Emily run around the park, James turned to Robert. "You know, I think Emily's the reason you came back into my life. If she hadn't spoken to you that day in the park," Robert nodded. "She was the catalyst for all of this. Somehow, her innocence brought us back together." James smiled, shaking his head in amazement. "Kids see things in a way we can't. She saw something that we ignored for years." Robert looked out at Emily, his heart swelling with gratitude for the little girl who had unknowingly led him back to his brother. "She's special, James. She's brought a light into my life that I didn't even know I needed." "She does that for me every day," James replied, his voice full of pride. "That's why everything I do is for her. I don't know where I'd be if I didn't have Emily to keep me grounded." Robert gazed at his brother, admiring the strength and love that James had poured into raising Emily. James had been through so much, but he had never stopped being an incredible father. Robert knew he had much to learn from his brother, not just about fatherhood, but about living a life with honesty and simplicity. "I'm lucky to have you both back in my life," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize how much I missed you until I came back." James smiled, his eyes softening. "We're lucky to have you back too, Robert." As they sat there, watching the sun begin to set, the two brothers, along with Emily, began to rebuild the bonds that had once been broken. It wasn't the end of their struggles, nor the resolution of all their issues, but it was a new beginning. And for that, Robert was grateful. With the sun casting a golden glow over the park, Robert felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the next phase of his life was just beginning, and this time, He wouldn't face it alone. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. A few weeks had passed since Robert re-entered James and Emily's life. The once awkward visits were now filled with warmth and routine. Robert had become part of their everyday lives, stopping by the market to help out, playing with Emily in the afternoons, and sharing meals with them in the evenings. Their bond, though still fragile in places, was mending in ways neither brother had thought possible. But despite the smiles and laughter, Robert couldn't shake a lingering feeling deep inside him, a need to give more, to show James just how much he regretted the lost time. He knew James didn't care about money or grand gestures, but Robert wanted to find a way to make a real difference, a way to show his commitment to their reconciliation. One morning, over a quiet breakfast at the small kitchen table, Robert decided to bring it up. Emily was already at school, so they had the house to themselves. "James," Robert began, his voice hesitant, unsure of how his brother would react. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we lost and what we're trying to rebuild now." James looked at him, nodding in silence, encouraging Robert to continue. "I know I can't make up for the time we lost," Robert continued, his voice more steady now, "but I don't want to just be the brother who shows up every now and then. I want to be a real part of your life, and of Emily's life." James put down his coffee, his eyes studying Robert carefully. "What do you have in mind, Robert?" Robert took a deep breath, his heart racing a bit. "I've noticed how hard you and the other market vendors work. I see the effort it takes to keep everything going, and I thought, maybe we could do something to improve it, something to help the whole community." James frowned, not quite understanding. "Are you suggesting what, exactly?" "I want to renovate the market," Robert said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "I want to use the resources I have to turn it into something better, a more organized space, with new stalls, better facilities. It wouldn't just be me throwing money at it. It'd be a project we work on together, something we can build to benefit the whole community." James sat back in his chair, clearly taken aback by the proposal. "You're talking about renovating the whole market? Making it into something more than it is now?" "Exactly," Robert said, nodding. "I've seen how much this market means to you, and to the people here, and I think we can improve it without changing its heart. We could make it better for everyone." James stayed silent for a moment, clearly weighing the idea. The market had been his life for years, a simple but honest way to support himself and Emily. He had always been proud of his independence, proud of managing on his own. The thought of Robert coming in and making such a large gesture felt a little overwhelming. "Look," Robert said, sensing his brother's hesitation, "I know this might feel like a lot, and I don't want to force anything on you or make you feel like I'm trying to fix things with money. I just thought, maybe this could be a way for us to do something meaningful together, something that helps not just you and me, but the whole community." James studied his brother, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. Over the past weeks, he had watched Robert change, watched him work to rebuild their relationship, to reconnect in ways that weren't just about apologies, but about showing up and being present. And though James had always valued his independence, part of him knew that accepting help didn't mean losing that. Maybe it was time to let go of some of the pride that had kept them apart for so long. "If we're going to do this," James said slowly, "we do it together. We plan it, we involve the other vendors, and we make sure it's something that works for everyone." Robert's face lit up with relief. "That's exactly what I want, James. I want us to do this together." And so, over the next few days, Robert and James began to plan. They met with the other vendors, listened to their ideas and concerns, and sketched out a vision for a new and improved market. Robert took care of the logistics, organizing contractors, arranging the funding, while James handled the community's input, ensuring that everyone felt included in the process. At first, some of the vendors were skeptical of Robert's involvement. To them, he was an outsider, someone who had left behind this simple life for wealth and success. But as the days passed, they saw his dedication. Robert wasn't just handing out money and stepping back. He was there, every day, working side by side with James and the others. He was committed to making this project a success. Months later, the market's transformation was complete. What had once been a collection of makeshift stalls was now a vibrant, organized space. New canopies provided shelter from rain and sun. The stalls were sturdier and more inviting, and there were even areas for families to sit and enjoy the fresh food being sold. It was a place where the community could gather, not just to shop, but to reconnect with each other. The grand reopening was a celebration that brought the whole neighborhood together. Music played, food was shared, and laughter echoed through the air. Emily ran around with her friends, her joy contagious as she pulled James and Robert toward the new play area. The two brothers stood back for a moment, watching as the community came together, their hard work finally realized. "I didn't know how to thank you for this," James said, his voice filled with emotion as he looked at the bustling market. "But I don't think I need to. You've done something incredible, Robert." Robert shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, James. We did this together. I just wanted to do something that mattered. Something that showed I'm here for the long run." James smiled, knowing that his brother had changed. He was no longer the man who had walked away so many years ago, consumed by ambition and blind to the things that truly mattered. Robert was someone who was ready to be part of their lives again, not just through grand gestures, but through the simple act of showing up. "You've done more than that," James said, his voice softening. "You've shown me that people can change, that we can rebuild what was broken." As they stood together, watching the market come alive, Emily ran up to them, grabbing both their hands and pulling them into the crowd. "Come on, Dad. Come on, Uncle Robert. You've got to see the new playground." Laughing, the two brothers allowed themselves to be pulled along, their hands clasped by Emily's small, determined ones. They walked together into the heart of the market, surrounded by the people they had helped, the community they had become a part of once again. For the first time in a long time, Robert felt like he was truly where he belonged. He had spent years chasing success, only to find that what he needed most had been here all along, with his brother, his niece, and the simple life he had once left behind. As the sun set over the newly rebuilt market, casting a golden glow over the scene, Robert knew that this was only the beginning. His journey wasn't over, but now, he wasn't walking it alone. And for that, he was grateful beyond words. I hope you enjoyed this emotional story. If it touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our future stories. Share it with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinions and suggestions so we can continue bringing you stories that move and inspire.